Hello, Internet. My name is Bret. This is my weekly live show. We're here talking about cloud native, Docker, Kubernetes, all the DevOps things related to containers, basically, every Thursday. So thanks for being here live. You get to ask questions of my guest and myself, and hopefully we have some good answers for you. But that's the reason we do this live, is to get your questions, to get your input. And honestly, I learn a lot from you guys. So thanks so much for being here. This week, we're going to be focusing on Kubernetes policies, and we'll even break down what that means, because maybe I don't know. And maybe just because I wear this Kubernetes shirt doesn't mean I know all the things. So I have great people on the show sometimes to teach us stuff. All right. If you didn't know, this show is sponsored by my patrons. Thank you so much to those that are supporting this show. You can follow along, link below in the description. On patreon.com/Bret Fisher. You don't have to give me money. You can actually just click the follow button and get my weekly updates on everything I'm creating, including this show, the podcast, the open source, blog posts, newsletters, whatever it is. It's all about containers and DevOps Cloud Native. So you can follow along there, or you can start supporting me with a coffee every month. Thank you to those that are doing that. I appreciate you. $5 a month basically gets you into some special stuff, including a monthly call that we just had a couple of weeks ago where we hang out every month. And we now have some regulars that have been around for a couple of years. And we just sit on a Discord chat and video and talk about our projects. We talk about what we're working on in DevOps. Sometimes we share code or share our YAML and Docker files to get feedback with everyone. And we just talk about what we've learned lately. And it's fun. So if you'd like to get in on that, that's the High Fivers Club. You can join our Discord server for free. That's right up here, devops.fan. We now have over 9,000, quickly approaching 10,000 people in that server, all focused on DevOps all day long. So please hang out there. Thanks to all those, again, supporting this show and the podcast. All right, let's get to it this week. All the way from the West Coast of the United States, I have my special guest, Jim Bugwadia. He's the CEO and co-founder of Nirmata, and that spun off a project for the CNCF called Kyverno. So we're going to break down all of those things. Thank you so much, Jim, for being on the show.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure.
Yeah. And if you didn't know Jim's background, he's actually currently a co-chair of the Kubernetes Policy Working Group. And we're going to actually ask in a minute what that's about. And then he previously worked running the cloud practices team at Cisco. So he's got a lot of experience in this area, and this is kind of how he got started with his team. So we're excited to have him here. Let's get into it. So Jim, tell me your origin story of how you got to Nirmata, how Kyverno started. Like, give me the whole breakdown.
Yeah, no, I would love to. Yeah, so my background is in software development, and I still actively, kind of develop as part of the Kyverno community and other projects as well. So around like 2010, 2011, that time frame, when of course virtualization was mainstream in almost every major enterprise. Cloud computing was just sort of emerging as the next way. And that's where I was at Cisco. And what we were seeing is a lot of enterprises on the service provider side, as well as, other verticals starting to adopt cloud and virtualization technologies for infrastructure services mainly, right?
Yeah.
But to me, as a software developer, what was always fascinating is the impact that had on the application layer. So at that time, there were technologies, the state of the art was things like Cloud Foundry, Mesos, other, systems being developed and used at scale. I think very famously around like 2012 timeframe, Netflix was talking about how they migrated into their microservices architecture. And what that led to is myself, my co-founders, Ritesh and Davian, we were all at different companies. We had worked together in the past, had gone separate ways, but we kind of kept in touch and were exchanging notes about what we were seeing in the space. And we felt very strongly that cloud was going to have a big impact on how applications were developed, distributed, consumed, and managed. And at that time, we were kind of looking at the what was available as platform as a service, and something just seemed to be missing in that layer, right? And today, of course, if we fast forward, we know what that is. But this was very early. Not many people had even heard of containers or Docker as we know it now. And we started Nirmata with the mission of kind of solving problems at that application layer. So our background was in telecom, network management, working in areas where centralized management planes are used to manage distributed complex systems, which have to be like in telephony, of course. These systems have like finite requirements. They have to be always on, always providing service. So we wanted to bring that ease of use, that same seamless management capabilities into applications and software in general, right? Because today, if you look at any business, every business, of course, runs on software, depends on software as a core utility, and it needs to be always on. It is business critical. So those were the problems we started solving, and around that time frame is when we first met Docker and kind of fell in love with how it helped package and deliver and abstract applications away from infrastructure. So that just seemed like so right in terms of the next foundation above infrastructure as a service. But of course, there was still a lot of discussions in the community, in the space about how to orchestrate and manage these applications at scale, containerized applications. And there were still debates between Swarm and Kubernetes and Mesos. So we, provided a lot of consulting services, built some tooling around Docker in our early years. And around 2017 is where we felt that Kubernetes had emerged as that, sort of de facto standard and was enterprise ready, which is when we launched our Kubernetes platform and offering. So our focus, given our background in telecommunications, was always around, we had a strong kind of policy component in our platform. And eventually that led to, as we worked with several customers, and we would always ask, like, why is it that they picked Nirmata? What do they love about it? What features they would like to see? And it always kind of came down to policies and policy management. So in around 2018, 2019 is when we decided to open source our policy engine, which we named Kyverno. Kyverno is a Greek word for to govern. So it kind of fits in with policies for Kubernetes, and we donated Kyverno to the CNCF about a year later, and it's phenomenal to see the community adoption and growth since.
Yeah, you were saying you were telling me before the show, 2,000 stars on GitHub, and uh, that's not easy to come by, especially in
Right,
especially in CNCF where we get new product announcements every week.
that's
So
true.
yeah, congrats on that. And I think something that would help me and hopefully some of our audience is when you say the term policy management, what is and isn't that?
Right. Yeah, that's a good question, right? Because as a developer, if you tell me or tell anyone that, okay, I have to kind of, follow some policies, typically we think about a security organization sitting in some other corner of the building and they're, setting these policies and, kind of doing some governance or compliance mapping and things like that, right? Um, Here, what we're talking about, and the reason why, at least I feel Kyverno sees so much success is we embracing policy as code, and we're codifying policies almost as a digital contract to make it easy for what developers need to do in Kubernetes, right? So if you think about any Kubernetes cluster within any enterprise or organization, there's several roles that are involved in operating, managing, securing the cluster, the shared services, and then the workloads, the applications which need to run on that cluster. So, how do you do all of this at scale is still a dauntingly complex set of problems to solve. And policies, we believe, play a major role in securing and automating those handoffs across these different, we talk about DevOps and DevSecOps. So if you think about a developer who wants to deploy an application, they want to focus maybe on that 20 or 30% of the resource manifest that they care about, right?
Right.
And then you have the ops team that wants to set operational, best practices, configurations. Like maybe they want to control how the pod security context is configured in every workload, and so that would be something that an ops team does. And of course, the security team wants to see periodic reports from all of this, and wants to make sure that their container images are secure, that there's vulnerability scan performed, the right configurations are in place and are being enforced. So yes, maybe all of this can be done manually, but that seems again very complex and very cumbersome. And we believe that by approaching or policies or making policies as part of the this digital handoff or contract, it can be fully automated, right? So one interesting thing in Kyverno from the very beginning is policies were not just about verification and enforcement, but they were very heavily about automation as well, right? So Kyverno has full support for mutate, generate, other type of rules, which we can, dive into in more detail to show how these policies would operate, and how some of this automation can be handled.
Yeah. I was trying to show Kyverno on screen. Let's see what I can get there. Talk to me a little bit about. So, does this include things like RBAC? Are network policies involved? I mean, it sounds like there's some host policy stuff applying here, right? Like if we're talking about
Right.
not elevating to root, or maybe limiting certain bind mounts or something like that, or whatever ports, something like that. What's in
Yes.
scope?
Let's take a look at some examples, right? And I'll actually I can also
Perfect.
let me pull up Kyverno. I'll share my screen. Yeah, so if you kind of see how Kyverno is organized, just to maybe quickly explain its architecture, and then I'll dive into what sort of policies can be applied. So Kyverno installs itself as an admission controller, right? And I'll show this on my local cluster of what it does. But when you install Kyverno, it plugs in because Kubernetes is extensible. It allows admission control webhooks to run within your cluster. Kyverno securely registers itself with the control plane as a mutating and validating admission controller. Then, based on the policy set you configure in Kyverno, and Kyverno policies are Kubernetes resources, so they can be managed with any kind of, if you're using Visual Studio Code for or other, tools like Customize, kubectl, you can use all of those to manage Kyverno policies. But then, based on that policy set that you configure, Kyverno will register itself, with the API server to receive those requests, and then apply the policies. So again, based on your settings, you can block certain requests, like we were talking about, like if you don't want to allow certain bind mounts, right, which is a best practice for pod security. By default, you can deny that, and then for certain namespaces, you can add exceptions to say you want to allow select configurations, right? So Kubernetes itself, of course, has, if you go to the Kubernetes docs and look at policies, they will kind of mention a few objects like for RBAC, for pod security, a network policy, which are built-in policy objects. But those are typically not enough for all of the best practices as well as security configurations required. So which is where other admission controllers like Kyverno or even OPA Gatekeeper, which is another project which also provides policies in Kubernetes. These are highly recommended for any production deployment, right? Um, and once these policies are configured, again, it's very seamless for users because they're just making kubectl requests or API server requests, and the policies are being applied in their background, and they can see the errors, warnings, and the results from these policies.
Nice. So at the practical level, you're talking about if I'm the developer running my running my app, and I'm probably partially responsible for the YAML I have to create. I'm no longer saddled with the expectation of knowing all the security policies and implementing it in my own YAML. This is sort of farming it out to the ops team and the sec team, to to have their own resources that they're managing separately, and I can feel safe that basically the way I know I didn't follow the rules was I did something wrong in my YAML and it gets declined essentially on apply, or what is the
That's
expected?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And let's take a look at this in example, right? So I have, I'll show a quick demo on my local cluster. So I'm just going to use, I'll go to my shell, um, and I have, a Minikube cluster I just kind of spun up a few minutes ago. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the standard install command just to pull down Kyverno and install it, right? So at this point, Kyverno will, all that's required is once you run this, and there's a Helm chart as well. But just by running the YAMLs, now you see it's registered a number of custom resources. It uses internally, if you're running HA, it will do a leader election across like different instances of Kyverno. And then it also, there's a number of different roles that kind of it will configure for different policy levels, etc. It registers itself as a webhook. And now it's at this point, it should be ready for operations, right? So if we do, let's check the logs. So Kyverno is up and running, and it shows, if you kind of scroll down here, it says, okay, it's ready. The webhook has registered and it's ready. But at this point, I have no policies, right? So if I still do a kubectl run, and one of my favorite demos is, something I saw, I think it was Duffy Cooley who showed this at a KubeCon. If you kind of run this one-liner, right, what it's doing is basically it's starting a container, it's changing some of the YAML configurations, it's running an NS-enter, and then trying to get access to a bind mount to slash proc here, right? So if I run this on my cluster, which is just a default cluster, nothing else configured and running, the way container security works, of course, is at this point I can see, it looks like I'm on a Linux root. And if I look at, what permissions I have root permissions at this point, right? So by default, because Kubernetes doesn't provide some, these type of anything to kind of block or enforce pod security, either, the recommendation is to run entry, capabilities like PSPs have been deprecated, but there's a pod security admission controller being developed. But that, is not as flexible as things you could do with, engines like Kyverno. So to prevent this, and by the way, just to kind of show, if you go to like var logs, let's see what we can see over here. If I go to log and I should be able to see all my containers running here, right? So sure enough, it shows like core DNS and other things. So obviously, just by running, having permissions to run a container image, I'm able to get to, root and to be able to at least, access other things within the setup itself, right? So obviously not a great thing, and something we want to prevent. So I'll show, kind of as a next step, what can you do? I'll first delete this container. So we'll just go ahead and delete root. And I'm going to install Kyverno's implementation of pod security standards, right? So if we go to Kyverno policies, and by the way, in the community, there's almost like 130, as you see, sample policies created, a great set of best practices, other kind of use cases that can be solved. But for this demo, I'm just going to go to pod security, and I'm going to run, this customized command, which will implement about 15 different controls. So there is in Kubernetes, there's pod security standards. There's 3 levels, that are recommended or standardized, I should say. Baseline is typically what you would want to at least run at baseline, but ideally you're running at restricted and just adding exceptions for workloads that need other privileges, right? So in this case, what we'll do, going back to my cluster, I'll run a customized command, which is going to pull down about 10 to 15 different policies and put them in enforce mode, right? So I want to make sure that these policies are blocking workloads, which are running with higher privileges than required, right? So as you can see now, and CPOL is just short form for cluster policy. So I have a bunch of policies which are coming, which should become ready in a few seconds. So uh, we'll see a few more of those go ready. And as that happens, now Kyverno will start enforcing these on any workload that's being created, right? Seems like it's taking a couple of seconds. Let's see if most of them are ready, right? So the main ones we want to block are running as root user, things like that, right? So we should be good at this point. So let's try that same command again, which previously, we were able to kind of get to host and see what happens. So immediately Kyverno is blocking because of several policies failed, right? So first off, if you're running in the restricted mode, you're required to drop privilege capabilities within your container. You shouldn't allow privilege escalation. You should set run as non-root to true. So all of this is kind of now easily available just at admission controls. If you already have workloads which are running with these insecure settings, Kyverno will also produce a policy report, and those reports are also available within the cluster as a Kubernetes resource itself, right? So again, going from just a stock cluster to going to a pretty secure cluster in a few seconds is possible now, and that's really our part of our goal of introducing Kyverno and as a project is to make sure Kubernetes can be, as secure by default as possible in an easy to use manner. And these type of, again, developers, to go back to your question, are aware of, okay, what needs to be done to their workload to be able to secure it and configure it correctly. Um, you can also write, by the way, mutating policies to automatically inject some of this data. And there's examples on the Kyverno website of those as well.
Nice. Oh, by the way, we're having upload bandwidth issues, so I'm recording this video for later, but I think people are missing a lot of the demo because I'm evidently only streaming upload at 1 meg all of a sudden. So,
Oh,
but you're fine. You look great to me. So everything's great on my end for you coming in. It's just for some reason not getting to YouTube.
okay.
But I'm recording the show, so we just keep rolling, and then what we'll do later is we'll edit it down and re-upload the video as a new YouTube video, and people can watch it after the fact. So, um, all right, sorry, where were we?
Yeah, we were talking about, the like, for pod security and some of these use cases, what developers would focus on and how the ops team and security teams can help with these policies.
Yeah. So this kind of okay. So we're setting up sort of the use cases, the problems we're solving. Removing the obligation from developers to actually be the expert and expect their YAML to be perfect. Um, where does this? So where does this? I guess maybe what things aren't covered by this that someone also needs to be concerned by? Like I mentioned a whole bunch of stuff earlier, but are there areas that these kind of policy gates aren't covering
Yeah,
or are
great,
covering yet?
great question, right? So there are a few, you know, I guess for lack of a better term, you can call them like corner cases or dark corners in Kubernetes. Like
Right.
one of the areas was, if you kind of run static pods, which the kubelet itself can directly bring up, right? So it used to be that the API server does not see those. But now there is a concept of mirror pods, which gets created as part of that creation, and the API server does have access to them. Even things like if you want to exec into a pod, there is an API request that is triggered for that. So more and more, most of the operations that you would want to do within a Kubernetes cluster are covered through admission controllers and policy engines like Kyverno. Of course, if you're trying to, verify, now there's things like CIS benchmarks, which would not be covered by Kyverno because those are checking for cluster configurations,
Right.
and depending on your, how you're bringing up your cluster. If you're using a managed cluster like through a cloud provider, those would have to be checked at a different level, right? They're not visible inside the cluster itself.
Yeah. And yeah, so cluster operators don't get to use these tools to help them deploy a properly secured Kubernetes host, for example. Yeah. Okay.
Correct.
And are there things that were like? Is there anything I'll talk about on the horizon in terms of like these, like you said, these edge cases or scenarios where maybe certain parts of the resources aren't controllable? Is like, where do you see this going? I think I saw
Right.
that it was like 1.6 release. Like, what are we not doing yet that we could enhance in the future with Caverno?
Yeah. Yeah, so certainly today, and it's still a lot of folks are still at the level, and because of the complexity of Kubernetes, now control planes are being deployed securely, right? So that seems like step one, and through whether it's through managed service providers or through even using kubeadm and other tooling which has
Mm-hmm.
evolved and become very very usable. But once that happens, the next step is to kind of have pod security, which we just kind of went through as a quick demo. There's other challenges, and you mentioned the policy working group. So there we certainly take a more holistic approach to policy for cloud native and for Kubernetes. And we also, through the working group, what we have done is taken the same policy reporting format that's available in Kyverno, and that's being proposed as a CRD, as a custom resource, which can be used by other policy engines as well.
Mm.
And that could be beyond admission controls, right? So through the policy working group, we have adapters now for kubebench, which can do the CIS benchmarks I was just kind of referring to, and produce a policy report which can be now consumed by administrative tools like what we do at Nirmata and other kind of tools which would provide more comprehensive kind of viewpoint of your Kubernetes and your cluster security. Similarly, for vulnerability scan reports, for things like even runtime security concerns, so there's Falco as well as kubearmor and other projects which are using eBPF for runtime security, right, to detect some of these things, which could potentially maybe the admission controller doesn't catch.
Right.
So looking at it from a more comprehensive perspective, we recommend really those four things, to have periodic vulnerability scanning done in your CI/CD pipeline, those reports be available to policies, and then to be able to do admission controls, which is your really your last line of defense before things go into a cluster. To be able to do CIS benchmarks at the cluster configuration levels, and then as a final kind of a checkpoint, to also have something that's listening to runtime events, and checking for things which are unexpected, right? Which look like abnormal behaviors which should be reported.
Right. Like an exec command or a shell running in the pod or something like that. Yeah.
Right. So one thing just though to point out, even exec commands can be admission controls will catch those, right? Because there is a connect request which is sent
Mm.
to the
API.
API
Yeah.
server, and Kyverno can have a policy. Let me see if I can find an example of that in our policy library. Yep. So this is a policy which blocks exec. So it's the connect request, and based on label, it will say you cannot exec into this pod, right? So you could flip this on by default, but this example is just showing. And notice here, the Kyverno policy is actually making an API server call. It's checking for the label of the namespace, and then enforcing this policy on certain namespaces.
Right. Nice. So, and maybe this is a good time. This kind of leads me to thinking about Nirmata and like the correlation between the two and the difference of these two products. Because if I recall right, Nirmata was started first. Like you actually had the company,
Right.
and then you had this idea of outsourcing this stuff for Kubernetes, or open sourcing this stuff rather. Tell me a little bit about like that. Like let's get into as people adopt this tool. I'm assuming there's a path to Nirmata for a superset. Is that right? Superset of functionality.
There is. Yeah, no, that's a good point because I guess as in our journey at Nirmata, we did, for various reasons, we ended up doing quite a few things, perhaps not in such a typical manner, or maybe even, we chose the harder path, but which we felt, was the good longer term path. So yes, Nirmata started first. Kyverno kind of emerged out of Nirmata, um, uh, and as we kind of were trying to figure out, okay, what should Kyverno focus on, and what will Nirmata provide above and beyond. Really, our mission is to make, again, to bring security automation to Kubernetes, and make Kyverno full featured. And like you see, we provide every policy we create. We also, contribute, and the community contributes. So we're not trying to kind of say we're gonna, have some special content or special subscription in Nirmata. The approach we have taken, though, is, when it comes to multi-cluster and managing policies at scale. And I'll just quickly show what Nirmata looks like. So this is, I'm logged into my account in Nirmata. I have a couple of clusters. If I drill into any cluster, I very easily now see, some reports and things on policies, right? And I can, use Nirmata to collaborate on policies, to dig down, see exactly, what violations exist, and to get details, even to assign ownership or to add an exclusion. All of these things, which, if you're managing a fleet of clusters, would be extremely difficult to do otherwise.
Right.
Nirmata helps with that security, collaboration, the assignment of who should get these. So what security teams and ops teams love about this is they can not only, so first of all, this grade is a nice feature because it immediately tells you, hey, look,
Wait,
there's some
shouldn't you
work to
have
be
an A? Like I would think that you would have.
right. Well, this is, some demo cluster
Right.
somebody's attached into this account, right? But yeah, so now immediately, as if I'm the owner of this namespace or this workload, I can go and see what do I need to fix, and how do I, kind of get to that. I can also get alerts. So you can set up kind of those alerts from your various policy groups. So here we have a bunch of default policy groups, everything from best practices to pod security. If you are using projects like, Crossplane, you can even write, policies like, one of my colleagues wrote a policy here to prevent RDS access or restrict what can be configured there, right?
Hmm.
So lots of interesting use cases, some on the supply chain security. Multi-tenancy is another huge topic where there's a lot of, interesting use cases for policies. Um, but once that's done, yeah, it's just a matter of providing in Nirmata simple, easy to use reporting, kind of being able to dive in, share and collaborate on these, and manage them at scale, right? So that's kind of where we see the bounds. The other interesting thing is we also see, of course, integrations into, especially as we're talking about some of these more complex use cases, like with supply chain security, integrations into other tooling, which Nirmata can do, operating at the SaaS level, which makes it, again, easier to manage a lot of this at scale.
So underneath, we're still running Kyverno on the clusters, right? And this is sort of like a management layer on top.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. So you can. So I guess for me, like as a new person, I need to learn Kyverno first, and then sort of adapt that. And then does this help with the deployment methodology at all, or like should I be starting with Nirmata if I'm going to even consider this? Like what does the adoption look like typically, or
So
your
we
recommended
see
path?
So we see both, right? We see a lot of Kyverno users drop in a Nirmata controller and start, collaborating on policies, things like that. And we do have a, free version to use. We do see also, if you start with Nirmata, Nirmata can help, and it will deploy Kyverno automatically. So
Hmm.
the onboarding path, and I'll just quickly show what that looks like. If I go to clusters, if I say add cluster, and let's say I wanted to even add my Minikube cluster, as you would expect, basically I can select a cloud provider, and then it will let me download a YAML, run that on my cluster, and now I have attached that into Nirmata, right? Once that cluster is attached, it really operates like any other cluster. So here I have a vSphere cluster, which is showing me my policy report and my scores, and it will automatically also deploy the recommended set of policies, right? So that can be configured again centrally. So you could say, well, if you see this default label, it means those policies will be pushed down by default. So for example, for best practices, not using the latest tag, right? So simple thing, but a good best practice to enforce. So this policy will be, pushed down. It's in audit mode by default, so it just shows you where the violations are, and gives kind of developers a chance to fix that. Um, Now, keep in mind also as a best practice, these policies can also be applied in your CI/CD pipeline. So you get that as soon as you kind of submit a PR or you make a change in your manifest, you can run Kyverno there and see some of the kind of outputs as well as what needs to be fixed. But uh, from the Nirmata point of view, going back to your question, we see either you can start with Nirmata, deploy Kyverno, and get the default policies in, which is very simple to do. Or you can start if you're already using Kyverno. Nirmata recognizes that and will not change anything, but will start showing the visibility, the tracking, and allow the collaboration and other features on it.
Nice. Yeah, that seems to flow pretty well together, and I really like the projects. I mean, this is kind of becoming the default, right? In cloud native, where the essence or the core of the SaaS product is open source and a part of the CNCF,
Right.
and then there's this extra layer added on top. Which honestly, at the end of the day, like I talk about a lot on this show, where I say, I don't know anyone with free time. I don't know any ops, security, DevOps teams, developer teams that have suddenly free time to manage more open source projects, and that I always talk about that you're either giving it costs you either in time or money. Like choose
Right.
one. Most of the teams I talk to have a little money, and so I'm always looking for that easy way for them to learn and apply something, but also let's make it easier by just managing it with the SaaS, right? And so
Right.
it's great that you had Nirmata first. I think that's not the normal strategy, but I think that really helps you have a mature product that people can adapt instead of it just being like a beta. And you've had this for years, right? So this is something that you've
Right.
got all these customers on. Do you see for Nirmata? We've talked a little bit about like what's next, maybe for the policy in general. Are there any sort of like what's the future of Nirmata? What are you looking at?
Yeah, so certainly a few things we're very focused on is first off, so policies are great at an operational layer, but there's also this need for solving a lot of problems at the compliance and governance layer, right? So policies become the right building block for that, and having policies as code as first class Kubernetes resources, having the policy reports in place, all now allow us to automate compliance and governance. So that's very exciting. That's more for the security teams within these organizations, and Nirmata offers those features. So you can start building your compliance mappings. You can say, okay, if I want, to follow the best practices for CIS benchmarks or NSA hardening, how do I do that, right? What does my checklist look like? And underneath, we're using Kyverno policies. So our whole approach is to be very open and flexible with those, but with, you get sort of instant value again from the Nirmata perspective. The other, angle and the other kind of area where we continue to expand and we see a lot of exciting room to grow as well is if you kind of look at the entire software supply chain, and within the policy working group, there was a paper published recently on Kubernetes policy management, which emphasizes the need for policy starting early in the software development lifecycle, right? And
Mm,
the CI/CD pipelines today, of course, enterprises who were once maybe deploying 2 or 3 releases a year are doing dozens of pushes to production daily by adopting these cloud native technologies and modern CI/CD pipelines. So it's very important that within these those systems also be secured, and within those systems, there's a need to start producing data which policies can then enforce at admission controls and at runtime through background scanning. So things like vulnerability scans, and this is very rapidly evolving today. At one point, it used to be you would have to go with a proprietary or closed system to get value for end-to-end vulnerability scan reports, right?
right.
Now there are emerging standards where you can use open source tools to produce scan reports in, let's say, a VEX compliant standard, which is something being, proposed by OWASP as part of the Cyclone DX, kind of family of standards. So it could be any tool that produces this, this vulnerability scan report, and then through projects like SigStore, assigning that scan report in the CI/CD pipeline with the right provenance data, making that available to policy engines like Kyverno really becomes exciting, right? Because now you
Yeah.
can complete that entire picture and have traceability end to end to say, I know exactly where my image was built. I know, which, workflow or builder kind of or machine built this, and I know what kind of attestations I can enforce that there's a scan report produced, which has to be, let's say, within the last 3 days. It has to have certain, vulnerability scores, or if I want to go and search for certain packages in an SBOM, I can start doing that, right? Which even
Yeah.
just 6 months ago was like, how would you? It's such a daunting set of things to tackle, but now it's possible through open source and intercompatible, kind of these standards and things which are emerging.
And you're talking about all this on running infrastructure, which is, I think, right. That's what you're not talking about, like build time stuff, which is historically the way we all found out is at compile
Right,
time or at like server build time or maybe right before an audit, right? We do all the
right,
scans right before the audit, and then the audit passes and we're good to go. We had to do a bunch of work, fix a bunch of passes. Now we're back to normal, and then we go dark because it's a lot of human effort to do a lot of these things, like you're talking about CVE
right,
scans, SBOM vulnerability, dependency issues, and you're right. It's kind of operationally, we've traditionally focused on, is it up,
right,
or are we being attacked and stuff like that, rather than are we aware that even in a perfect world of Kubernetes where it's all supposed to be, we're running read-only container images and all this stuff, but everything is fluid, everything changes over time. The system that was secure yesterday is probably not secure next week, and
right,
you're right. It is, and there's an additional problem where even if you get to that level where there are things happening daily, or there's scans, or there's information that's being tracked daily, it's still very disparate, right? You end up with dozens of tools. This tool focuses on CVE scan, but it doesn't bring awareness in a central console anywhere. It's not like I'm getting in my monitoring console alerts around new CVEs that affect my production cluster while I'm staring at my monitoring ops screen. That's not a normal
right.
thing. So you obviously are on the tip of the spear of this infrastructure, and I'm the user that finds out years later that this stuff is possible. um, so where is Kubernetes? And this we've got some actually questions. Conrad's got some that I want to bring up here real quick. Um, where do you think is Kubernetes at the forefront of all this stuff? Where we're like the CNCF, obviously that's where our workloads are running. And you mentioned a couple of things there. You mentioned OWASP. We should probably bring that up or just even define what that is. Where should people be looking for this stuff
Yeah.
besides Nirmata?
Right. So certainly a lot of things going on in the Kubernetes community. So there are, security working groups. So there's tag security in the tags is technical advisory group. And then there's SIG security, which is special interest group. So SIG security focuses at the Kubernetes level and tag security focuses at the CNCF level, right? So those are great starting points. There's subgroups. There's an entire software supply chain subgroup within tag security, which is another great, group of folks working towards a lot of what I was just describing to see how software supply chains can be secured end to end. What are all of the components? And then there's also another Linux Foundation project and I'll quickly I can share my screen and show that as well.
Yeah.
Called Sigstore, which is aiming to do for for software container image signing and other related technologies. What in many ways Let's Encrypt ended up doing for certificate management, right? So
Mm.
Sigstore is another great community. It's also part of the Linux Foundation, so it's a kind of a sister community to CNCF. And Sigstore has a set of technologies. One of the things we've integrated into Kyverno is something called Cosign. And Cosign is this tool used. I think folks might be familiar with things like Notary and also Tough as the framework for Docker. Also was instrumental in developing that. So Sigstore has made you know signing and verification a lot easier and primarily for container images, but can be used for anything, for blobs, for files, for other artifacts. Like one of the features we're prepping for Kyverno is also to be able to sign and verify YAMLs, right? Because if you have policies now as Kubernetes manifests, how do you make sure your policies are coming from the right, sources and you can trust that policy, right? So those sort of things, Sigstore and Cosign make super easy to do. And within Kyverno, we have full support. If you kind of look at the image verification rule, it has support for now, integration into Sigstore, which can check. This is a very simple policy to check that every image that matches this pattern has been signed by a particular public key, right?
Nice. Yeah.
So this is what we're, and going back to your question on Nirmata and what have we focused on, we're kind of also integrating with the broader ecosystem around this to be able to, make this as seamless and simple as possible for, consumers everywhere, right? And the other, part of this, you went back to like your question on Kubernetes and its role. One other interesting kind of thought is Kubernetes is becoming very rapidly almost as a control plane for everything, right? So it's no longer just about applications and workloads, but
Right.
you can provision cloud services through Kubernetes using projects like Crossplane. There's projects like Tecton, and Tecton is very often talked about. If you're using for secure, CI/CD pipelines, there is a sub project called Tecton Chains, which allows building, container images, things like that, which can be signed, which can produce the right attestations, and then verified through Kyverno policies or other policy engines.
Nice. Yeah, I think that there's definitely I mean, just for me as an implementer, I find it challenging. I can choose products. I get that, but
Right.
there's a challenge where not everyone I work with has a dedicated security team that it considers Kubernetes their responsibility, right? Like, So it tends to leave it up to the DevOps team, possibly even just a DevOps person that's playing the ops role, or maybe some sysadmins that maybe they understand Kubernetes, like they understand kubadmin or rancher or whatever their deployment mechanism is for the infrastructure. But the world of policy and security is something that they I feel like sometimes they're years away from, right? Just because there's so much new to them, especially for ones that are just starting to adopt Kubernetes in the last few years. And it's always great to hear that we've got consensus, because I think that's one of the things that I even try to attempt on this channel is how do people make the choice? Like, first, what are the choices I have, and what choice do I make, and how do I even comprehend the choice of so many of these tools, so many options? And because this stuff doesn't necessarily come out of the box with Kubernetes, a lot of times people don't, people are still implementing pod security policies, right? They're typing it in the YAML of every one of their Kubernetes resources. And I'll often find a team that, as on their journey, they'll run a kube scan of some sorts, and it'll warn them that, hey, you're not preventing escalation of permissions. And so they'll suddenly go through this huge effort of going into every Kubernetes resource, right? And for every pod, they're applying this one line or 5 lines or whatever it is, to implement this standard that someone said, oh, you now need to fix this. And it's not really a comprehensive approach. I find it's very sort of hit or miss. And they ran a scanner, it complained about a thing, they fixed that one thing. And I love this approach where we can start applying a lot of these sort of policy and security focused tools at a like you said, you talked about a fleet, which I love that, because who has one Kubernetes cluster? The hobbyist, that's who has it, like me in the closet. That's the only person that has one cluster. So it's necessary, I feel like, almost up front for us to think, okay, how do we do this at a fleet level, not at, I got a Kubernetes cluster with some resources on it, and I'm applying a line of YAML into my Kubernetes. And I love educating developers, but at the end of the day, they've got so much to worry about that I love that we can remove this approach to something and put it somewhere else, give someone else that job, and they can sort of be the policy maintainer.
Absolutely.
What else?
To your point earlier,
Sorry, go ahead.
sorry, just to kind of add on that last thought, right? So even Kubernetes, of course, is constantly evolving, right? So there's configurations that change, there's new best practices that emerge, there's CVEs that show up. So all of this requires, policies. It's not a one-off or a one-time thing. It needs to be continuously monitored, managed, and maintained, just like a workload, right? So having that capability, I think we believe is key to success, and with Kubernetes, and really helps again, like, smoothen these handoffs between developers, operators, security teams, and other stakeholders around Kubernetes.
Yeah. I'm going to get to some questions real quick, because I feel like we've got some people with some good stuff in here. Conrad asks, how does this compare to the Calico network policies, basically?
Right. Yeah, good question, right? So network policies, there's the built-in Kubernetes network policy. There's also the Calico and Istio kind of have their own flavors of network policies and control. So those are mostly concerned with, preventing traffic at some level, whether it's layer 2 to 4 or, higher layer 7 across workloads, right? Kyverno policies are a much kind of deeper level. You can use Kyverno to generate network policies, either Calico or default Kubernetes network policies. But they are more concerned with configuration security, right? So making sure the best practices for any workload configuration, for pod security, and for network policies are enforced. And you can just make it easier. Instead of your developers writing a network policy, maybe, and we see this as a common pattern, you just ask them to add a label to the namespace, and you can write a Kyverno policy to automatically generate the network policy for them, right? So things like that become very simple, and doesn't require now developers to, learn how to manage, test, write, network policies.
Right. Yeah, because as if I feel like at the beginning, all these things were separate, right? We go back 3 years, whatever. So RBAC was separate from network policy, which is separate from pod policies. Like so many of these different layers that were all related to the same people implementing and managing and maintaining it, but all were disparate sort of ideas on the necessary things for a cluster, right? So that's a really good question, Conrad. Thank you. The next question he has is pretty good. This is referring to previously. Is your recommendation to start with Kyverno in the beginning? And I think you kind of answered that, but could you just reiterate for our audience?
So short answer, yes. Yeah. So we definitely advocate. So at the least, you require some level of pod security, right? So the options today are you kind of look at what's coming with pod security admission, which lets you put namespace level labels to define a pod security level. The challenge that we have heard from users on that is it's not very flexible because it's very typical within a namespace. You have that one Nginx pod, which requires some perhaps privileges or other kind of configuration to be allowed, and you don't want to give that same access to all the other pods or all the other workloads. So then at that point, you do need to run an admission controller, and Kyverno becomes a pretty good choice to look at. There's we support and test and in the community a set of pod security policies. So just starting with that as a default is certainly a very good best practice. And then also looking at the best practice policies, like we talked about for default network policies, as well as things like making sure that every pod has a liveness and readiness probe, or making sure that every pod is declaring some resource quotas, right? And
Right.
things like that, which become very important when you go into production. You can start enforcing and educating your developers and your teams through Kyverno, and that's the nice thing is it becomes this kind of digital contract again, which you're saying, hey, these are the best practices. You can start with audit mode, and then require maybe in production you want to block certain configurations, but you can just start with auditing and allowing those.
Yeah. And as a reminder, all of this is still YAML Kubernetes resources, right?
Correct.
Yeah. So that
Yes.
means we can implement a GitOps approach. We can have it documented in the Git log. And that's where I love, like, obviously you want that component that's validating and verifying that it's implemented. But I love that, we're keeping all this stuff in Git. And it's one of the questions I often ask of everyone on the show. It's like, okay, how can I do everything you just did in the browser, but do that in Git? How can I do that in YAML?
Yep.
Because often, we've all got all these different tools, right? And it's rare that there's one person doing the development and the ops and the DevOps all in one person. So you tend to have multiple people, and there's always this challenge of how do we ensure that these things will often change over time, right? There's never just the day one policy that stands forever. It's always something that's evolving. And how do we
Right.
track the changes? How do we all come together so that everyone can view the policies, including the business side? And I've actually got a team now on a consulting gig where we're doing that thing where we're sort of teaching them how now all this stuff you're doing we got to get it into Git. And it's
Right.
sort of like I'm standing on the soapbox. Get that into Git. Put that into Git. Stop using the command line tool. Put it into Git.
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah. So it's great that Kubernetes provides that foundation for us. All right. I think I got a couple more questions for you. We're going to do rapid fire. So Charlie is asking, what is the idea essentially around? Is this something that's likely to get merged into Kubernetes, or like these? We have these different policy management products that and CNCF projects. Do you see a future where those are sort of put upstream into Kubernetes directly?
Not as part of the core Kubernetes project itself, just because kind of sticking with the layered approach, and much like if you're running any Kubernetes cluster, you're very likely to be running Prometheus or a metric server or things like that. We believe and we would like Kyverno to become part of that de facto stack, right? But to so certainly and strengthening what Kyverno can do in terms of integrations with the API server we will continue, in term for that support and expanding it. But I don't see it becoming part of core Kubernetes itself, just
Okay.
because of keeping that layer clean and separate.
Right. Okay. Um, Next question, Biker, coming from my Windows crew. Are policies connected to RBAC and specifically systems like AD, Active Directory?
So, yes, so great question, right? So RBAC is another, of course, Kubernetes provides, RBAC capabilities, and it's pretty good. You can do quite a lot with it. One of the challenges, though, we see is, when it comes to fine-grained permissions, RBAC gets a little bit kludgy to work with. And Kyverno can help there by automating the creation, deletion of, RBAC, roles, as well as role bindings based on other triggers, right? So let's say you deploy a namespace and you only want to give the person who created that namespace the right to delete that namespace. You can now automate things like that with Kyverno fairly easily. So Kyverno can be used to enrich and extend, RBAC itself. And the second part of your question, like connecting to an identity system like Active Directory, that's very interesting too, right? Because Kubernetes, by default, as everyone probably knows, is doesn't have a concept of a user, or there's no built-in identity, right? You
Mm-hmm.
need to talk to some external AD, or some IDP where you can pull your identity information from. So we have seen there was a great webinar done by Ohio Supercomputers. They're a user of Kyverno. They're very active in our community. So they tied into their LDAP system, and they're doing HPC on demand, basically using Kyverno policies. So their students can come in and request like a Jupyter notebook or an HPC environment, and they will create the right namespace, the workload, go to their LDAP system, and based on that identity, make sure that they're allowing the right user with access to the right resources within that cluster, right? So all of this can be, kind of pulled together. And again, policies, if you start thinking about policies for automation, there's a lot of these interesting use cases that, come up.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, and I'm particularly excited that it's all on the same base stuff, right? And I've probably
Right.
said this before 3 times already in this podcast, but the idea that I don't have to implement a whole new set of workflows for the team to implement these kind of tools. Um, that's just one of the things I think that Kubernetes has really laid the foundation for. So if there's one thing that I'm excited about in the future Kubernetes is that as you want to add these layers, you don't have to start with them on day one, and you can add them later, and you don't have to implement a whole new workflow and team just to implement some of these policies. And I love how Nirmata is making it easier for that stuff. So great. Biker always brings the hard questions too. So he's on the show with the chat to bring the edge cases like Windows, which is close to my heart. Being a Windows admin for 30 years now, I think, just about. Well, thank everyone, by the way, for the questions. Sorry for the bandwidth challenges we've had. We're going in and out of the accepted YouTube bandwidth, and I have no idea because I did a speed test and it's perfectly fine. So something must be wrong with the server at YouTube that we're connecting to. That's going to be my excuse for today. But for those of you watching, Jim and I will be back. We actually are going to take this show and repost it to YouTube in its original high quality format for those. So expect that in the next couple of days so that we can, if you want to see the demos and maybe it was blurry for you or if you had buffering, just come back and a couple of days we'll repost this up with the original stream that I'm saving on my computer, which so far has been looking flawless and great as Jim showed some of the demos. So that's all saved here. We'll re-upload that, kind of replace this video of sorts so that you can watch that. Also, reminder that this show turns into a podcast. So every week we release a new one on Fridays. You can see the link for that below. I think there's a podcast link in the description. And that podcast comes out of this live show. So your questions get answered in audio format, and we basically edit it down. We take out some of the demos that don't make sense in audio only. We take out the intros and stuff like that, and we get into it really quick. So expect that in the coming weeks. We're usually 2, 3, 4 weeks behind on the podcast as we edit those episodes. So, Jim, This was awesome. I learned so much. Thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for being on the
My
show.
pleasure.
Yeah, and I'm excited to try these products out. I think for me, even coming from a background of security, having these tools it's always seemed a little intimidating to me to implement them, and I always felt like I had to learn a lot of other languages, and the fact that this can be in a Kubernetes YAML resource and that I can have optionally a web dashboard to help me understand this stuff, even implement it easier, really kind of, I think for me, helps me feel like it's not going to be a huge lift for me or my students or customers to implement that. So thank you.
Right. No, you're most welcome, and thank you to the entire Kyverno community. You're super excited to continue building and growing.
Yeah. And I'm looking forward to the next update. So when you get this next major release, I'm looking forward to having you back on the show. You're now going to be re-invited to talk about the future of this stuff, because I think there's more to be talked about for sure. Like we could sit here for another 3 hours, I think, and talk about all the different projects, the working groups, where to go find more information, how to dive in deep beyond just learning one tool. So we're definitely going to have more of that, I think, on this show in the future. So
absolutely, would love to.
Let's wrap it up real quick. So people go to nirmata.com. That's nirmata.com for the product. You can also find links, I'm sure, to Kyverno there. Kyverno is Kyverno for those listening. And they can. I'm assuming there's documentation, getting started guides, all the things there, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, so Kyverno.io has all the Kyverno docs. Nirmata.com is where you can go to find info on Nirmata and the docs as well.
Yeah, I see a big free trial button there, so I can click that and play with my clusters that way. And people can find you and Nirmata on Twitter. I have your little Twitter handle right below for everyone watching. So they can reach out to you with questions, and I encourage everyone to do that as they're playing with these tools. So you said you mentioned a community. Are there community resources? Do you have like a Slack
yes, so the Kyverno Slack is on the Kubernetes workspace. So the channel is just Kyverno. You can find us there, and certainly, there's most of the maintainers hang out there all the time. So feel free to post any questions. And also, on some of the other communities, they're all in the CNCF workspace as well as the Kubernetes workspace on Slack.
Nice. Yeah, I see that on the page there. There's actually the link straight to the channel in Slack. So for those of you who didn't know, if you're maybe new to Kubernetes, there's a CNCF and a Kubernetes Slack work groups that you can workspaces that you can check out, and most of the projects, if not all of them, have channels there that you can talk to other people. And unlike many of the Slacks, including my own, that one is actually sponsored by Slack. So you get to see the whole history. So you can actually learn in the past, scroll back. It's not going to cut off like I have a Slack for my courses and I don't pay for it. So, we lose everything after a couple of months of chat.
Okay.
So that's it's kind of nice to have stuff on the official CNCF and Kubernetes ones. So thanks again for everyone joining. Thanks, Jim and the team. I think we had some people in chat from the team. So thanks for being here. And we will see you next week. So again, the show's every Thursday. Podcast drops on Friday. Show's on Thursday. Coming up soon, we've got Rich and Lucas from Loft Labs to talk about virtual Kubernetes clusters. That's coming up in a couple of weeks. Next week, we're actually we're changing up the show next week, so I'm not sure. Basically, the way you find out about this show and who's going to come up next is to show up on Patreon. So if you remember from the beginning, I talked about the patreon.com/Bret Fisher. You can go there and just click the follow button, and you'll get the emails. Also, like and subscribe this channel if you want to get the notifications that way. If you click the little dinner bell icon, basically, it will notify you when we go live every week. And we'll see you next week here on YouTube Live. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.